Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our 9th and last video in this series, Module 5, dealing with the topic of management. And as you can see from this title slide, in this very last video, we're looking at the topic of managerial control. Managerial control. Well, what is all this about? Well, this is probably the least glamorous of the 4 managerial functions. Remember the 4 functions? Planning, organizing, leading, and control. Well, this is the least glamorous of the functions, but it's very, very necessary. So let's talk a little bit about managerial control. Why do we even need to talk about this? Why do we have this as one of the primary managerial functions? And what I've given you here, if you notice at the top, what is that? Well, it's an oil refinery. It's an image of an oil refinery. We have several here in the Bay Area, especially near the Bay, right? Up in Richmond and around Antioch and some places like that. You're familiar with these places, right? They take raw petroleum products and refine them into gasoline. And we'll mention why I've got this as an illustration of control. But first, let me answer the question, why control? You see 2 phrases there. You should remember these phrases. They're not in your textbook, but these will be important to you for the rest of your career. You cannot improve what you cannot first control, and you cannot control what you cannot first measure. Let me repeat that. You cannot improve what you cannot first control, and you cannot control what you cannot first measure. These are very, very crucial, important principles when we talk about any kind of insisting on improvement in a process, whether it's how you hire people or how you become more efficient in producing your products or services, or how you improve customer satisfaction. No matter what you're talking about in business, you can't improve things if you cannot first control them, and you cannot control them if you cannot first measure them. So let me tell you now, within that broader principle, why are we looking at an oil refinery? Well, because some of you probably took chemistry in high school, and you may remember the basic premise of the scientific process. When you have a chemical process going on, like refining petroleum, you typically have a particular temperature or a range of temperatures in which this chemical reaction works the best, right? And what does that mean? You have an ideal temperature you're shooting for, but quite frankly, things vary. And therefore, what does that mean? You have a lower control limit, and that in between your ideal but not yet your lower control limit in this part, things will still happen. You'll still get gas at the other end of this refining process. And of course, not only do you have a lower control limit, but you have an upper control limit as well, right? In between those 2 control limits, if the temperature's in there, you've got refining going on. If you're below the lower control limit, no gas coming out the other end. If you're above the upper control limit, well, get a fire extinguisher. Fire, right? Okay, but you understand then that part of your job in high school chemistry, if you're dealing with this chemical process, right, is to measure and control the heat so that the temperature always falls within these 2 limits. Can't get too cold, and you certainly don't want to get too hot. And so this is part of the control process, this concept of keeping your measurement within acceptable limits. I hope that makes sense, because the next principle is the basic control process. The basic control process you see lined out here, you're going to start with establishing acceptable standards for any particular process or procedure. Number 2, you're going to measure what is actually going on when women and men are engaged in whatever that process is. You're going to compare their measured performance against what you already established as the acceptable standard. And then step 4, you get to determine, well, what are you going to do based on what you measured? Are you going to, 1, maintain the status quo? Number 2, is there a deviation and therefore you need to correct that? Or do you simply, in the long run, change the standards? Well, let's talk about that in greater detail. Number one, you're going to establish your control standards, the target against which performance will be compared. Now you have to express this in actual measurable terms, right? So it's not good enough to say, we want to be the best. Well, how do you measure best? Is it in terms of market share? Is it in terms of level of revenue? It has to be something measurable, right? And this measurement has to be consistent with and relevant to organizational goals, right? So whether it's the level of customer satisfaction, it's the percentage of market share, whatever your actual organizational goals are, that's what you're measuring to see how are we doing with regard to achieving those goals. Are we making progress? Does the measure match up with what the goal is? And whatever this target is, it needs to be identifiable as an indicator of performance. Now, once you've established your control standards, that's step one. Step two is measure the performance. Performance measurement, as you see there, the first bullet point, is an ongoing process. You don't just measure once, you measure along the way. Now, you realize performance measures must be valid indicators of performance, right? Sales, costs, unit produced. Depending on what you're trying to measure, you want to accurately shape and define what is it you're trying to measure and how are you going to measure it. You also should realize that every time you spend time and resources to measure something, it is an expenditure of resources. So you can't measure every single day, every single minute. You have to pick your points when you're going to measure because it can get costly. So you measure at the appropriate times. Nevertheless, that's step one and step two. Step 3 and 4, now once you've measured and you kind of get a sense for how your people are performing, you compare the performance against the standards you set in step 1. And so you have to define what is a permissible deviation from the performance standard. That's why we talked about earlier upper control limits and lower control limits. And you also have to utilize the appropriate timetable for measurement, right? That's why I say it costs to measure, so you don't want to measure in a timetable that's inappropriate. And finally, now you get to decide, what are you going to do once you've got the measurement of actual performance compared to what you want as a standard to express the fact you're making progress in organizational goals? Hey, if you've set a sales quota, this is what you want your sales department to accomplish, and you've met it, well, then you've maintained the status quo. You don't have to do anything. Your people are performing fine. However, if they don't hit the number, you have to ask yourself, how low is acceptable before you hit the lower control limit, right? If you were gearing for $100,000 in sales and they didn't make it, but they sold 98,000 out of that 100, maybe you say, that's an acceptable deviation. That's cool. Okay, they didn't hit the target, but they were darn close. Okay, of course, if you set a sales target of 100,000 for the period and they only hit 20,000, that probably is not an acceptable deviation from the standard you've set. Now you get to decide, well, what are we going to do about this? Right? Do we maintain the status quo? Do we increase training? Do we have to let some people go? Or do we change the standard if the standard we set in step 1 was simply unreasonable? It was too high or too low? These are all the kinds of questions that you need to be practically answering when you are attempting to measure and assess and control any process in your organization. Once you've set the standard, you've measured actual performance, and you've compared the two numbers, now what do? Right? Quite frankly, if you've set the standard correctly, then the question is, are your people able and willing to hit the number? And one of the questions that come out of that are they properly trained? Are they properly motivated? Do they have all of the resources available to them that they need to succeed? And then, as a result, what would explain the performance level? If there's a deviation from the standard, why is there a deviation from the standard? Is it because they require additional training? Is it because customers have proven far more difficult and stubborn than we thought they were going to be? Are they not trying hard enough? What's the answer to this question? Why the deviation, right? These are all the kinds of things that are involved in actually implementing a control process. And this, too, is part of what it means to be a great manager. To not be afraid to measure and set standards, and to hold your people accountable to those standards, and most importantly, to ask the questions and understand if there's a deviation, what shall we do about it? Why is there a deviation? How do we address this? Do we keep the status quo? Do we change the standards? Or are we going to have to address the fact there's a deviation in the process to begin with? All great questions. And I hope this gives you a sort of a flavor for what it means to be a great manager. It's a lot of plates to keep spinning. It's a lot of things that demand our attention. This is why I say continually, management is not for everyone. However, for those of us who have the ambition and the desire to be great managers and to lead and manage others, great opportunities for those of us who have the skills and will develop the skills to manage well. Well, I hope that's helpful. This is then our 5th module in Business 101, Introduction to Business, module on management. More on all of this content, of course, in the textbook. Thanks so much for your attention. We'll see you in the next module.